The interaction between Scandinavians and Slavic communities, although extensive and quite diverse, has long been under examined, often obscured by either nationalistic historiographies or the dominance of ecclesiastical histories. However, the archaeology and textual evidence paints a picture of profound entanglement, especially on the Baltic shores and along the eastern trade routes of the Rus. Let's have a quick look. Despite decades of scholarly debate, the precise origins of the Slavic peoples remain elusive. Linguistically, the Slavs are part of the Indo European language family, and that means they are also related to the Germanic peoples. However, the archaeology of the early Slavs is quite ambiguous. Now, I am not an expert on the matter, but I can tell you that attempts have been made to locate a Slavic homeland, and various regions in Eastern Europe have been proposed, from the Pripyat marshes to the Dniester Carpathian zone. However, material continuity is quite fragmentary. Early Slavic interactions with Germanic peoples are also difficult to date precisely. Most is inferred from hydronyms, that is, river names, and linguistic borrowings rather than from securely datable artifacts or settlement data. Many rivers in Western Slavic lands retain names of pre Slavic origin that suggests that the Slavs appropriated and settled lands formerly inhabited by other peoples, such as Germanic communities or Celtic ones, or even older Indo European populations, often without obliterating previous toponyms. So, this might indicate either cultural coexistence or the absorption of socially subordinate remnants of earlier populations. The migration period, so that would be sometime between the 4th and the 6th century, marks the first appearance of Slavs in the historical record, particularly through the writings of Byzantine and Gothic authors. We have Jordanes, for example, and his work Getica. He offers the earliest extended reference, and he does that while recounting a Gothic victory over a Slavic group he calls the Antes, and this group was led by a figure named Boz. His narrative might be politically charged, but it does demonstrate that Slavs were present in the steppes north of the Black Sea sometime around the 4th century, and they were also military active. The etymology of this word, Boz, is likely a corruption of a Slavic word for leader or commander. His execution, along with that of his sons and no fewer than 70 chieftains, if we were to believe the source, testifies to the martial organization of Slavic peoples. However, this event is very difficult to corroborate archaeologically. In a different source, in Procopius of Caesarea, writing in the 6th century, we find the Slavinic and Ante groups described as inhabiting the forested regions north of the Danube, and Procopius assigns them a distinct set of religious beliefs, emphasizing the thunder god and water spirits. A description that would correspond to later portrayals of the god Perun and associated cults. Following the withdrawal of many Germanic tribes from Central Europe, notably Vandals, Goths, and Lombards, Slavic populations moved into vacated areas in present day Poland, in eastern Germany, and the Czech lands. Some written sources, Procopius, namely, describe these lands as empty, and we actually do have some paleo-environmental studies supporting the idea of a temporary depopulation, but the extent of that remains debated. The question of whether Slavic settlement involved the displacement or the absorption of remnant Germanic populations is still unresolved, and we don't really have archaeological sites confirming cohabitation unequivocally. The preservation of non Slavic hydronyms and the potential continuity in rural settlement patterns suggest that some degree of social interaction and integration might have occurred. By the 7th century, Slavs had established themselves in regions as far west as Carinthia, as far south as Dalmatia, and as far inland as Moravia and Bohemia. The first notable formation was the so called Slavic Empire under someone called Samo about the year 658. This was actually a Frankish adventurer who united the Slavic tribes in resistance to the Avars. This was short lived. But the state does prefigure a more enduring polity, which is that of Great Moravia in the ninth century. Great Moravia played a pivotal role in shaping early Slavic Christian identity. Moravian rulers, they were dissatisfied with the Latin-speaking clergy because it was imposed by the Frankish Empire. So instead, they turned eastward and invited a couple of Byzantine monks by the names of Kirill and Methodius to establish a Slavic liturgy. And the decision had profound consequences because it meant the invention of the Glagolitic script, as well as a translation of liturgical texts into Old Church Slavonic, which allowed for the development of a distinct ecclesiastical culture. The Christianization of Great Moravia thus occurred not merely as a process of conversion, but also as a political act. It was a crucial moment in the Slavic world's detachment from the Frankish ecclesiastical authority, and it meant the integration into the broader Orthodox sphere. Now, from the late 8th century onwards, Scandinavians, especially from the region of Svealand in Sweden, as well as the island of Gotland, expanded eastward along the river systems of Eastern Europe. These Varangian traders, as they are called in the Byzantine sources, as well as warriors, followed routes from the Baltic to the Black and Caspian seas, and they established control over key portages and trade hubs. In these regions, the Norsemen came into prolonged contact with Slavic, Finnic, Turkic speaking populations, and a hybrid community emerged, collectively known as the Rus, eventually forming a polity centered on the Dnieper River, culminating in the state of Kievan Rus. Although Norse in origin, the Rus quickly adopted Slavic language, religion, and customs. So by the time of Vladimir I, who accepted Christianity from Byzantium and baptized the Rus in 988, the Scandinavian element had been almost completely assimilated. We should be wary of the dynastic centric narrative we have in the Russian primary chronicle, which is a later chronicle from the 12th century, and it attributes the foundation of the Rus to Rurik and his descendants. However, archaeology points out something else, which is a more diffuse and contested landscape of power centers. We have, for example, Novgorod, Knyzdov or Polotsk, and other so called central places. The Rus are thus emblematic of a profound synthesis between the Slavic and the Scandinavian element. We do have a Scandinavian element in the elite structure, but on the other hand, we have a Slavic outcome from a linguistic, cultural, and religious standpoint. On the southern Baltic coast, a different kind of Slavic Scandinavian encounter unfolded. Here we have Western Slavic tribes such as the Obotrids, the Veleti, and the Pomeranians, who engaged in trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict with the Danes and the Swedes. Coastal ports such as Volin, possibly the legendary fortress from Icelandic sagas known as Jomsborg, served as a commercial node linking Scandinavia with Central Europe. Political alliances and dynastic intermarriages reinforced these ties. We have a very fascinating example in the person of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, because he married Tuve, who was the daughter of the Obotrid ruler Mistivoy, and this exemplifies the permeability of elite boundaries. Runestones, such as that in Söndervising, erected by Tuve herself, attest to the symbolic and familial entanglement of Slavic and Scandinavian elites. We also have archaeological evidence confirming Scandinavian mercenaries in Polish service, especially during the reign of Mieszko I and Boleslav I. We also have chamber graves, such as those discovered in Bosia and Kalus, and grave goods with Norse iconography, and this would reveal a presence of Scandinavian style warrior elites, or at least some kind of connection to them, integrated into Western Slavic polities. The cultural exchange was reciprocal. From the Viking Age onward, significant Slavic populations settled in southern Scandinavia, particularly on the Danish islands of Lolland, Falster, and Bornholm. We have toponymic evidence in village names of Slavic origin, as well as archaeological findings, especially pottery types known as Baltic ware, which would support sustained Slavic presence. Slavic potters and artisans appeared to have contributed significantly to Scandinavian material culture. We do have some architectural techniques used in Danish fortresses, such as the Trelleborg ones, and bridges, showing structural similarities to Slavic fort building practices, as seen in some archaeological sites in Mecklenburg and Pomerania. Now let's talk a bit about religion. The earliest detailed testimony on Slavic religion belongs once more to Procopius. His account of the Slavs worshipping a single thunder god aligns with the later attested cult of god Perun, known from the Russian primary chronicle as well as other Eastern Slavic sources. Perun is frequently linked to Thor because they share attributes such as the thunder, weaponry, as well as martial prowess. Procopius mentions that he was the only god, but that would have been a Christian interpretation. Best case scenario, they would have had henotheism, so that means one very important god and many other secondary um, beings. We have other examples of deities. As a matter of fact, we have Veles or Volos. He would have been associated with cattle, with magic, and the underworld, and he appears in treaties between the Rus and Byzantium as a god invoked for oaths. Functionally, he would have been analogous to Odin or Uller in the Norse sources. Another deity by the name of Prove would have been worshipped in Vagria and associated with law and assembly, something that might parallel the attributes of the Norse god Tyr. Another example would be Dashbog. He would have been similar to Freyr or Njordr in the Norse sources because he was associated with wealth and fertility. Now, the sacred landscape of the Slavs included anthropomorphic idols, something we also see in with the Norse, as well as nature spirits, and they had a particular interest for river beings, for nymphs. These spirits inhabited springs, rivers, forests, nature in general, and um, they were people connected to them via sacrifices and libations. Such beliefs align closely with what we know from later Slavic folklore, which kind of retained a sort of animistic cosmology, even in modern times. Scandinavian sources, interestingly, also describe a similar situation, a sacralized natural world. So we don't only have the gods, we also have the so called Vatir, the land spirits, as well as many other entities, such as the female ancestral spirits by the name of Disir. Many other things believed to have dwelt in groves, rocks, and waters, and from this point of view, closer to the common people than the gods would have been. One interesting aspect of comparison would be that of human sacrifice. Human sacrifice is widely documented in Norse sources. If you read Adam of Bremen's account of Uppsala, for example, and it is also confirmed archaeologically, but it is notably absent in early Slavic sources, including Procopius. Later Latin accounts, however, such as Thietmar of Merseburg and Saxo Grammaticus, do report human sacrifices among Western Slavs, particularly during times of war and crisis. For example, we have the Temple of Retra, said to have conducted such rites. Notably, horse sacrifice, which would have been quite central in Norse rituals, such as again in Uppsala, is absent from Slavic accounts. However, they did practice something called horse oracles. A sacred stallion was kept near a temple or inside a temple and was led over arranged spears or planks, and its behavior would have been interpreted as some sort of divine sign. These rituals seem to have had deep roots because if you read Tacitus, he reports similar practices among early Germanic communities. Scandinavians also practiced stuff like divination, lot casting, prophecy, and so on. And in saga literature, especially the seeress, the so called Volva, played a prominent role in foretelling fate. In Gautrek's saga, which is indeed a later saga, a legendary saga, we have an example of a sacrificial selection of a victim by lot, which would parallel some Slavic motifs. So there kind of was a connection in this area. Procopius reports that Slavs made vows to their god in battle. If spared, they would perform a sacrifice, and all these aspects, although, well, quite debatable because the sources are a bit limited, would imply a transactional vow based form of petitionary sacrifice, akin to Norse practices of offering before and after battles of voyages. And for such martial societies, this would have been actually expected. Slavic sanctuaries, such as the circular temple at Großraden in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in Germany, show construction technique either influenced or parallel to Scandinavian and Germanic models. We have anthropomorphic carved posts, central cultic spaces, ring-shaped wooden enclosures, which would suggest a convergence of ritual design. We also have the Temple of Szczecin in Poland. This is described in Herbert's Vita Autonis, and it was richly adorned with sculptures of birds, beasts, and humans, details that closely resemble the iconographic program of stave churches in Norway. Whether this reflects direct Scandinavian craftsmanship or local imitation of Norse artistic forms remains controversial, but the visual culture of the Baltic religious world was clearly interconnected. Despite the presence of Scandinavians in Rus, Slavic theonyms remain distinct. I think this is also very important to underline. The Russian primary chronicle, for one, contains rich theophoric material from the time when Vladimir I was a pagan, but we don't find any Norse names or Norse inspired names of any kinds of deity. So, what can we say in the end? Well, we can say that Slavic Scandinavian interactions were deep, quite durable, as well as multidimensional, especially along the Baltic and in the Rus. They were, however, ultimately subsumed by the greater force of Christianization. Scandinavian culture did leave some marks, particularly in artistic forms, military organization, and mythological analogues, but it was Christianity brought from Byzantium in the east and from the Frankish Empire in the west that actually reshaped the spiritual and institutional life of the Slavic world. However, the legacy of these encounters, preserved in folklore, in place names, in ritual fragments, and shared memories of things like river spirits and the thunder god, testifies to a medieval North that was not isolated or monolithic, but in fact forged into this crucible of encounters.